At 7:35 p.m., December 25, 1991, the flag of the once feared Soviet Union was lowered in front of the Kremlin for the final time. Once the largest and perhaps most feared nation in the world crumbled down before everyone's eyes. The fall of the Soviet Union can be attributed to many different factors. However, none are more important to the nation's demise as its political space, its suffering economy, and its military. On March 14, 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev was elected to be president of the Soviet Union for the next 5 years. Due to the policies Gorbachev introduced, such as the freedom of speech, perestroika, the shortage of goods, the rapidly declining economy, and increased military spending, caused the Soviet Union to fall, forever changing the world. The fall of the Soviet Union was a pleasant surprise to many people. It was once the world's largest nation, covering 8,650,000 miles, or 1/16 of Earth's land surface. It had a population of 290 million people, with over 100 distinct nationalities living within its borders. In 1990, it had the third largest economy, with a GDP of $2,659. And a military of 5 million troops scattered all across the globe. The goals of the Soviet Union were simple in speech but differ vastly in actuality. They were striving to create a true democracy and have a country where everyone is equal, both in power and in wealth. The goal of communism is to create a classless society where all are equal and work an equal and fair amount. This is the economic system in which the Soviet Union was built upon during the Russian Revolution that finally ended on January 6, 1918. In 1922, a treaty was formed between Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Transcaucasia, which formed the Soviet Union. Cracks first started appearing in the Soviet Union during the Cold War that started shortly after the end of World War II in 1947. An important part of the Cold War was the out-of-control arms race between the United States of America and the now 25-year-old Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was spending massive amounts of money on the Cold War every day, each time trying to show up the United States, with the United States responding each time with an even more impressive military. It was at this time when the world became aware that mutually ensured destruction was just a button press away. Because of both the Soviet Union's and the United States' massive military growth and expansion of their nuclear arsenal, they both possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world several times over. At any moment, a button could be pressed that could end the entire world. People were terrified. Drills would often be performed in school where students would hide underneath their desks in case of a nuclear attack. This was a terrifying time to be alive, not only in the United States, but in the entire world. All of this rapid expansion cost the Soviet Union a lot of money. Some estimates show that, when adjusted for inflation, the Soviet Union spent nearly $5 trillion on the Cold War between 1947 and 1965. This is a massive amount of money to be spent on a meaningless war, for a nation that was already struggling to keep its population fed. There was a severe lack of food in the Soviet Union. They did not produce enough food to feed its citizens, so they relied on imports to feed its massive population. However, because of the massive and out-of-control military spending during the Cold War, people of the USSR were being neglected. The military always got top priority in the Soviet Union: food, innovations, funding, before any other parts of the USSR. There was hardly ever enough food on the shelves, leading many to go hungry. On April 28, 1986, workers from a small nuclear power station in Forsmark, Sweden, reported higher levels of radiation on them. The plant was shut down despite not finding any radioactive leak from it. They began to look at other places. Many other nuclear power stations across Europe were also reporting higher than normal radioactivity, with the worst of which being in Finland, with radioactive ratings being 10 times greater than usual. Sweden began to suspect that this catastrophe came from the Soviet Union. On April 26, 1986, 2 days before any additional radioactivity was discovered in Sweden, Unit 4 of a nuclear power plant in Chernobyl exploded. The cause of the explosion was a combination of underexperienced operators in charge of keeping the reactor core stable, breach of protocol during a power outage safety test, and a Soviet design flaw intended to keep the reactors cheaper to make. On April 25th, there was supposed to be a test of the power plant's power outage safety system. However, it had to be postponed due to an increase of energy usage. Instead, they decided to have the test at night with a team of people who were not experienced, did not know about the test until 5 minutes prior, and many of whom never knew the test was going on at all. Nikolai Foreman was ordering the operators to rapidly decrease power output to the reactor. However, the reactor was already running very low on power, causing a buildup of xenon inside the reactor. Normally, the reactor gets hot enough to burn this away. However, on that day, the reactor was running on very low power. Foreman ordered the water pumps that cooled the reactor to be shut off. A nuclear reactor is controlled by boron rods that block reactions between the elements in the core. When the power is needed, the rods are pulled out. During that night, all of the rods were pulled out of the reactor because of irrational decisions made by Foreman. Now unrestricted, the reactor started producing more power than it was ever intended to do so. None of the cooling pumps were on, so there was no way to cool the reactor down. They pressed the emergency button that immediately puts all the boron rods back into the reactor. However, the tips of the rods were not made of boron but of graphite, which rapidly accelerated the reaction, causing a massive explosion, resulting in more than 400 times the amount of radioactivity that was released when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. However, the government did not admit that the accident had occurred. They urged citizens that everything was okay, even though first responders to the scene were dying in horrific ways due to radiation poisoning. Some sources indicate that the members of the Communist Party went so far as to steal Geiger counters out of school science labs in order to keep the disaster a secret. The government did not make any acknowledgement of the disaster until May 14th. In that time, countless people were exposed and died to the incident, many of which could have been saved if the Soviet Union had alerted the public of the danger. Additionally, the Soviet Union knew about the rod design flaw and knew that it could potentially cause an explosion, but did not tell anyone about it. They destroyed any reports that suggested that, and made sure that no one would ever find out. This tragic incident caused the citizens of the Soviet Union to lose their trust in their government. They risked the lives of potentially millions of people in order to save a little money on the construction of nuclear power plants, and when a catastrophe did happen, the Soviet Union did not tell the members of the public, causing many of them to die horrible deaths. It is hard to trust the government when they keep such a dangerous secret from its people. The people of the Soviet Union could no longer trust its government, and they lost faith in the economic system that ran it. In an attempt to prevent something like this from happening again, and to try to get the citizens of the Soviet Union to trust their government again, Gorbachev decided to give the people glasnost. When Gorbachev was elected as head of the Communist Party in 1986, one of his primary goals was to give the freedom of speech to the people of the USSR. Previously, especially in the days of Stalin, those who expressed different views than the government or criticized it in any way would be imprisoned, forced to do hard labor, or executed. Gorbachev wanted that to change, especially after the public outcry as a result of Chernobyl. After the citizens of the Soviet Union were given the freedom to speak freely, criticism of the government began coming in. One of the many things that the people were complaining about was classism in what was supposed to be a classless society. People who worked for or who were friends with the government had many more luxuries than the average person in the USSR. Most citizens of the USSR were starving and poor. By 1976, only 2/3 of families in the USSR had refrigerators, and 50% of the citizens fell well under the poverty line. While many scraped together the little money they had to buy a little bit of food, some would eat well at fancy restaurants, take luxurious vacations, and look down upon the average citizen. The Soviet people were furious that their supposedly classless nation clearly had two different classes: the friends of the government and everyone else. The Soviet Union was built upon communism, and in communism there are no classes. Everyone is equal. This clear divide made the population want reform, and now armed with the power of freedom of speech, they could spread the word to everyone without risking prosecution. The economy of the Soviet Union had a large piece to play in its downfall. One of the largest problems that the USSR had was that they could not produce enough food or merchandise to keep on the shelves of stores to feed its massive population. The Soviet Union relied heavily on imports from other countries, but even then it was still not enough. However, with the new policies made by then US President Richard Nixon severely restricted the Soviet Union's trading partners, which made it exponentially more difficult to feed its already starving population. Many people in the USSR starved and died as a result, and the public was hungry for reform. In 1970, oil prices skyrocketed as a result of Iran jacking up oil prices in order to make a higher profit off their valuable resources. This caused many industrialized countries that received most of their energy from oil to become conservative with the amount of oil that they consumed. This was called the 1970s oil crisis. However, the worst was still to come. Because everyone was being so conservative with how much oil they purchased, the invisible hand determined that the price of oil would plunge from $120 a barrel in 1980 to $24 a barrel in 1986. This massive plummet was called the 1980s oil glut, which severely crippled the Soviet Union. The USSR ranked number 2 in the world for oil production, producing 19% of the world's oil at the time. Because of this massive plummet in oil prices, the Soviet Union's economy took a big hit. This worsened living conditions even further for the citizens of the USSR, which already had a very low standard of living when compared to the Western world. Before the 1980 oil glut, food shortages were already a daily occurrence, but now it was even worse. Countless people were hungry, and they were starting to see the flaws not only in their country, but in the fundamental principles in which their country was built upon. This hit to the USSR's economy made the nation incredibly vulnerable to external factors. For example, when the United States restricted the USSR's trading partners, it hurt them significantly. This was not only because their biggest export, oil, was now almost valueless, but because they did not provide even near a surplus of food to feed its massive population. When we look back at history just a few short years, this is precisely what gave Adolf Hitler the ability to rise to power and give him the idea of invading countries so that he would be able to acquire their resources to give back to the people. The absence of food is one of the largest factors when it comes to a revolution. Revolution often happens when the population is hungry and the government is not doing anything about it. This is one of the many reasons why the Soviet Union fell. Gorbachev tried to fix this using a few different methods, one of which was perestroika. Perestroika was an attempt to bring the Soviet Union out of poverty. He put the means of production, such as factories, for sale for anyone in the USSR to buy. When previously the state owned them, as what is done commonly in a communist nation, now the rich of the USSR could buy them and get even richer. Although the factories were now decentralized, prices on goods were still controlled by the government, resulting in the worst aspects of both capitalism and communism coming together in an economy that was already suffering. Additionally, the financial bureaucracy blocked Gorbachev from making any significant changes that would have been needed to save the Soviet Union. On January 31st, 1990, the USSR finally got their first real taste of capitalism. The McDonald's opened up their doors in Moscow. This was the first time that many had experienced good food at low prices. While the entire communist nation could not feed its population, just one capitalist company was able to feed them. This made the citizens hungry for capitalism. In addition to bringing in capitalist ideologies into a communist state, the USSR was plagued with inflation. This can be attributed to it deciding to print more money in an attempt to make more products. In order to make money, you have to spend money. But what if you don't have any? Well, then just make more. This is precisely what the USSR did. However, they were making more money than new products. So instead of helping the economy, it just caused massive inflation of their currency. When inflation occurs, people still have the same amount of money as before, but now the prices for goods and services have increased dramatically, leading to many people to go hungry. The food shortage was now more potent than ever, and the food was too expensive for anyone to buy, and the little money that the USSR was making was not going to its people, but its military. The Soviet Union's first priority was always its military. The Soviet Union started increasing its military spending in the early 1970s, but then dramatically started increasing spending with the election of the United States President Ronald Reagan in 1981. Although no one knows for absolute certainty how much money they were spending, most experts believe it was between 10 to 20% of the GDP. Even at times when the economy went down, like during the 1980s oil glut, the military still remained well-funded and well-fed. Their military always got new technology, more food, medication, and innovations, well before the population of the USSR. This caused yet another clash between people of a classless society. While most people were starving on the streets, military personnel were relatively well-fed and taken care of. Due to increased military spending, the Soviet Union was spending less and less money on the people living within its borders, starving them, many of whom were dying as a result. This not only weakened the workforce of the USSR, but also made people see the flaws not only in the nation, but in its economic system. Additionally, during the infamous arms race that occurred during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, required exuberant amounts of money and resources. The military continued to get top priority when it came to research and development, food, and medication. Products that many people in Western countries enjoyed, such as modern electronic and mechanical goods, were just reserved to military use in the Soviet Union. In 1979, the Soviet Union took its massive army to Afghanistan in an attempt to spread communism to this country by any means necessary. The Soviets were afraid of losing communist favor in Afghanistan, so they thought that going in there to show how communism was stronger and better than capitalism would convince the people to have a communist society that would later trade with the Soviet Union. The USSR took control of a quagmire region known as the Graveyard of Empires. They poured billions of dollars into a pointless war, further weakening its economy and making the citizens back home suffer. Over 1 million Soviet troops participated in this brutal war, with 15,000 dying and 1,000 more wounded. All this reckless military spending and death severely weakened not only the Soviet Union's economy, but also its image and spirit. The Soviet Union had a broad amount of beliefs and religions, so much so that many of the soldiers and the people back home felt more closely related to the people they were fighting than the people they were fighting for. Those in Central Asian republics of the USSR felt that it was wrong to be fighting in Afghanistan, as they felt they were betraying their own people. As a result, they did not want to kill people they felt related to, and saw the war, as well as the Soviet Union, as evil. They thought that this was Moscow's war, not theirs. Because of this new right of freedom of speech, the soldiers spoke out against the horrible tragedies that were going on during this war. Protests against not only the war, but the entire communist state were popping up all across the massive nation. On August 27, 1991, the Communist Party of Belarus declared independence from the Soviet Union. A few hours later, Moldova proclaimed independence as well. By the end of September, all three Baltic states formally left the Soviet Union and shortly after joined the United Nations as now free and individual countries. One by one, sections of the Soviet Union were declaring freedom from the once feared nation, and on December 19th, the Russian government took over all functions of the Soviet Union. On the 25th of December, Mikhail Gorbachev announced his resignation as the final president of the Soviet Union. Less than half an hour after that speech, at 7:32, the hammer and sickle flag of the Soviet Union was lowered in front of the Kremlin for the final time. After examining all these factors, we can clearly see that the fall of the Soviet Union was due to the newfound freedom of speech that the citizens of the USSR now had, the horrible living conditions due to the economy, and a military that takes priority over everything else, as well as the suppression of information from the government. When Mikhail Gorbachev took office in 1968, the social landscape of the USSR started rapidly changing. One of the major elements that this brought was the freedom of speech, which directly corresponds with the fall of the Soviet Union. With the new hybrid economic system failing, bringing the worst out of both communism and capitalism, it brought down everyone's spirit, making the people of the USSR hungry for a new government. The suppression of information about the dangers of the Chernobyl power plant explosion made people lose faith in their government. It is no wonder why they wanted a new one. Gorbachev said that this was probably the single biggest reason why the nation fell in the first place. With the economy ruins due to the 1980s oil glut and no food to put on the shelves of stores, many people went to bed hungry every night, many of which died of starvation. When McDonald's came to the USSR to show a glimpse of what living conditions were like in other countries, It made people see how flawed their own system was, making them crave capitalism. With what little money the USSR had, instead of feeding their people, they were going to war with people who many citizens felt related to. This was the final straw. People needed to be free to start a true democracy with a less flawed system. Once the largest nation in the world, reduced to a handful of independent countries. Without the implementation of freedom of speech, the 1980s oil glut, or its massive military spending, the USSR may never have crumbled.